Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's session of our summer series on the dynamics of change. Special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today, and if you'd like to see previous sessions, you can use the link that was in your reminder email today to find them on the series page. We're so pleased to have Professor Benjamin Sommer joining us today. His session is called The Evolution of Law in the Bible, 3 Case Studies, and we'll be looking at sacrifices on the altar and Passover, and if there's time, Shabbat, as cases where there's significant evolution of the law within the Bible, and he will tell us more about that. But I wanted to thank him not only for teaching today, but also pinch hitting because we had another scholar had to cancel. And we know that we can always count on Dr. Sommer to have outstanding material in his back pocket, and here he does. We're also so grateful to JTS trustee Yael Aspel for sponsoring today. Thank you, Yael, our MVP of Monday webinars, with your generosity sponsoring at the Navi level. And I know that Yael is very interested when he sponsors in inspiring other folks to sponsor. So we hope that other people will be inspired by this opportunity and by Yael's leadership as well. We have 3 sponsorship levels at 540, 1,000, and 1,800. You can always get together with someone else who who learns with us on Mondays to sponsor together. That makes it more within reach. Anyway, we'd love to get more people involved in sponsorship, and it really makes the series possible. On that note, I will turn it over to Tani Schwartz-Herman for a couple of additional announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format for our session, Professor Sommer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have some time for Q&A at the end as well. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Sommer. Since we receive a large number of questions, we would appreciate it if you could express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today. We'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Benjamin Sommer. Dr. Sommer joined the JTS faculty as professor of Bible in 2008. He has written several books, which have been the recipients of multiple awards and prizes. His most recent book is Revelation and Authority, Sinai in Jewish Scripture and Tradition. And you can read more about his publications on the full bio that appears with the sources. Dr. Sommer has long been active as a lecturer and scholar in residence, teaching rabbis, Jewish educators, and lay people in a variety of settings in the United States and in Israel. And I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Sommer.
Hello. Thank you, Julia and Tani and Ellie. Thank you very much to Yael and to all of you for being here today. As always, it's a pleasure to see a number of familiar faces and familiar names, and also to see a lot of dozens and dozens and dozens of what for me are new names as well. So I'd like to talk today about change in the law, the evolution of law, and the differences between different legal practices that are found in various parts of the Bible. Specifically, from among many, many different examples that we might go to, I'm going to be focusing today specifically on ritual law, laws especially about worship that we find in the Bible. And I'm going to try to make an analogy between the way ritual and worship worked among various communities in biblical Israel and the way that ritual and worship have worked in rabbinic Judaism for the past 15, 16, 17, 18 centuries, and in fact, the way that ritual and worship work in our own Judaism today. What I'll be pointing out is first, that over time in ancient Israel, there was evolution. There were deliberate changes that occurred in ritual practice, just as in rabbinic Judaism over the centuries, there have been there has been a certain amount of evolution. There have been deliberate changes that were put into effect in our ritual practice. And number two, in ancient Israel, there were different types of ritual practices simultaneously in different Israelite communities, just as today. We know that there are parallel, similar, but in some respects, different types of ritual practice in various Jewish communities that exist today. So, for example, probably it is the case that the vast majority of us on this Zoom call are from an Ashkenazic background, and we attend synagogues that mostly follow Ashkenazic practice. When those of us from that background have visited other types of synagogues, a Sephardic synagogue, a Yemenite synagogue, somewhat more rarely, let's say, an Italian synagogue, we know that we walk into synagogue and lots of things look familiar. We open up the Siddur and a lot that's in the Siddur looks familiar, but once in a while we'll be sort of caught up and surprised by something that's not exactly what we expected. That is to say, the wording of a particular prayer might sound familiar, but it's a bit different than what we're used to from Ashkenazic practice, or the order of a particular part of the service might be a little bit different than what we're used to. I'm going to try to point out that that sort of difference within Jewish ritual practice, within Jewish worship, was the norm from the very, very beginning. In other words, that a certain amount of variation within Jewish prayer, within Jewish worship, it's a feature, it's not a bug. It's always been a feature of our religion from the very, very beginning. So let's look at a few examples. The first example that I'd like to look at on the first page of the handout and going up until the second page of the handout, that first example is going to involve the laws of sacrifice and specifically the laws of the altar. So Ellie has shared this on your screen. You can just look at this on your screen. Some of you might prefer instead going into the chat, clicking on one of those most recent chats and downloading this and looking at this as a PDF final screen. Some of you might just find that a little bit easier. That way you can control when we're going back and forth if you want to suddenly look at something from a previous page or something. So I'd like to talk about the laws of the altar in different parts of the Torah. Now, those of you who have studied with me before know that when I'm looking at the Torah, at the 5 books of Moses, as a modern Bible scholar and also as a certain kind of modern religious Jew, I'm not assuming that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are the product of a single author, whether that author is God or Moses. Rather, I'm following the judgment of modern biblical scholarship that views the Torah as really, in a sense, an anthology of ancient Israelite literature. There are several different originally independent documents, we modern Bible scholars believe, that were spliced together to form the 5 books of Moses as we know them. Furthermore, here and there within the Torah, there are places where there's an original document, and then there's evidence that some scribe has supplemented the original document so that what originally might have been, let's just say randomly, 10 verses has grown into a 20-verse passage, as here a couple of words were added, and there several whole verses were added, and then at the end an appendix was added as well. So what I'm looking at when I'm looking at laws of worship, ritual laws within the 5 books of Moses, within the Torah, what I'm looking at, I believe as a modern biblical scholar, are several different documents that talk about the same issue, talk about the same type of worship, but do so in different ways. So I'd like to take a look in particular at 3 different passages within the Torah that talk about how to carry out ritual sacrifice, how to carry out the korbanot, the sacrifices that were a main part of worship for the ancient Israelites, though of course they no longer are for us today. The first passage that you've got there on the handout is from Exodus chapter 20, starting at verse 21. And this brief passage shows up in the book of Exodus immediately after the Ten Commandments, after the Aseret HaDibrot, after the Decalogue, and that's not a coincidence. Worship at the altar, that is to say, sacrificial worship, was tremendously important in ancient Israelite religion, in biblical religion. And so, not surprisingly, actually, the first law that's mentioned after the Ten Commandments themselves has to do with worship at the altar. And more specifically, we're told, well, okay, if you're going to be sacrificing animals and sacrificing certain vegetable items on an altar where you'll be burning these animals or this vegetable matter, well, how do you make an altar? What would be a kosher altar? What is a proper altar? And we get the following laws. I'm just going to read from my translation here. I'll read in English. You can follow along in English or in Hebrew. Make an altar of earth, that is to say, an altar of dirt for me, God says, and sacrifice your whole offerings and your sacrifices of well-being on it, and your sheep and your oxen. In all the places where I cause my name to be mentioned, I shall come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stones, do not build it of hewn stones, because if you lift your tool, or actually sword, I should have translated, literally it's sword. If you lift your sword upon them, that is some iron object that you use to shape the stones, you will profane them. You will profane the stones of the altar. Now, what interests me in this particular law isn't so much the question exactly of how to make an altar, but it's the fact that there's more than one type of direction. From the fact that the preference seems to be that you should build the altar out of earth, that is, out of dirt, but you can also build it out of stones. It's obvious that in ancient Israel, there was more than one altar. If the assumption was, well, there's going to be one temple for all the 12 Israelite tribes in the future once we get into the land of Israel, there will be one temple with one big altar there that all the Israelites use when they travel to the temple on pilgrimage, then there wouldn't be a need for two different types of directions. If there were only one altar, there would only be one direction for how to build the altar. But the fact that we get in verse 21 one way of building the altar out of dirt, and then in verse 22 a direction for how to do it if instead of dirt you're using stones, tells me that there were multiple altars being envisioned by this law. Furthermore, if you take a look in verse 21, there's a phrase, B'chol hamakom asher azkir et shmi, in all the places where I cause my name to be mentioned. We have a plural form there. It's in all the places. For those of you who know Hebrew, let me just note that it's on the third line of the Hebrew there. The formulation B'chol hamakom in early biblical Hebrew, that's a plural form. Whenever you say B'chol ha'ex in classical biblical Hebrew, that means in all of the X's. It doesn't have to say mikomot. We don't need to have the plural ending ot on that noun makom. Just bechol ha indicates in biblical Hebrew grammar for classical biblical Hebrew that we're getting a plural form. So the language there also explicitly states that there will be more than one altar. A lot of us are used to thinking about one temple in ancient Israel and therefore one sacrificial altar. We know that there was one proper temple. Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, and that was the temple with the altar. That is the case by the time we get to the end of the exilic period in ancient Israel. That was also the case in the Second Temple period when the second temple was built. But at the earliest period of the period of the kings or the monarchy in ancient Israel, there were in fact many different temples. There was the temple in Jerusalem built by Solomon. That was the main temple. That was the national temple. That was the temple that received funding from the royal family. But there were also local temples. Any city of decent size would have its own temple. Even a village of a certain size was likely to have a temple. and probably people from local villages that were really, really small would travel to that local village temple. These different temples found around ancient Israel and ancient Judah had their own priesthood. Generally speaking, at these different temples, there were there were Levites who served as priests. That is to say, not only the descendants of Aaron, whom we call Kohanim nowadays, served as Kohanim or as priests, but probably any Levite was able to serve as a priest at these various temples. There are references to these temples in many parts of the Bible. Archaeologists have dug up some of these temples. If you go to the Israel Museum, you'll see actually much of the central part of the Arad temple, which was dug up by archaeologists in the 1950s and 60s, has been moved to the Israel Museum. Many of you have probably seen this, actually. Some of you might have visited in the Hula Valley, the very, very northern tip of Israel, the Temple of Dan. An archaeologist from Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem spent decades excavating the temple, the ancient Israelite temple in the city of Dan. And now it's actually an archaeological park. You can actually go into that temple. You can actually walk where the Holy of Holies used to be. You can see where the altar used to be. The norm in ancient Israel, actually for most of the pre-exilic period, for most of the period of the monarchies of ancient Judah and Israel, was that there were many different temples, so that when you wanted to perform a sacrifice, you didn't have to schlep all the way to Jerusalem. There was a smaller temple closer to where you lived, where you would go to perform a sacrifice when you felt a psychological need to do so, or you felt some desire to do so, or you were in fact required to do so for one reason or another. I just want to grab my phone and turn that off. I'm sorry about that. So that was the norm in ancient Israel for most of the period of the monarchy before the time of the destruction of the temple. And we get a law relating to that norm in Exodus chapter 20. I'm going to skip over to Deuteronomy chapter 12, where we're going to see that in the book of Deuteronomy, we get a different law. In the book of Deuteronomy, we get a law that says, no, you should only have one temple. So let me read a bit of a selection from Deuteronomy chapter 12. There we're told, be careful not to sacrifice your whole offerings in any place that you see. Rather, in the place that Hashem will choose in one of your tribal areas, there you shall sacrifice your whole offerings, and there you shall observe all that I command you. So here we're told that there will be some place that God will choose. It's referred to as Hamakom Asher Adonai Yivchar. That phrase appears actually dozens of times in the book of Deuteronomy. There will be some specific city that God chooses, and that's where you'll be allowed to have an altar. Up until the time that God makes that choice clear, you can have many temples, but at some point in time, those local temples will have to be shut down, and then you can only offer sacrifices in that one temple. Now, that temple, clearly what Deuteronomy is alluding to with the phrase, the place that God will choose, Hamakom Asher Adonai Yivchar, that place is clearly the city of Jerusalem. It's Deuteronomy is talking here about the Jerusalem temple. That raises an interesting set of questions. One question that's raised here is, okay, so what happens to the other temples? And in fact, in the book of Kings, in the book of 2 Kings, we find out that a king named Josiah, a descendant of David, who was king of Judah, named Josiah, one of the greatest of the ancient Judean kings, he actually did put this law into effect. And when he did so, he made sure to close all of the local temples. The altars at the local temples were shut down. You were no longer allowed to offer sacrifices there. And instead, if you wanted to offer a sacrifice, you had to come all the way to Jerusalem. Archaeologists claim, the archaeologists who excavated the temple at Arad claim to see evidence of that altar having been toppled at a certain point in time. And they suggested, and there was some evidence in terms of the dating to make this plausible, They suggested that this happened in the time of King Josiah, when the local temples were shut down. So the local temples had to be shut down. Another question that comes up has to do with eating meat. Up until the time that the local temples were shut down, all meat that you would ever eat had to be eaten as part of a sacrificial ritual. You couldn't just have a piece of meat. If you were going to kill one of God's creatures and enjoy that meat, you had to do that as part of a ritual along with God, in a sense. Some of the meat had to be burned on the altar. In other words, you could never really eat meat as a human being all by yourself. You could only have meat as part of what we might call a shared meal with God. You had to share some of that meat on the altar with God, specifically the fatty parts and the organ meat, which was very prized. That had to go onto the altar, and you were able to have the remaining parts of the meat. So you were always having a shared meal with God. And I think the idea really was actually that, in a way, God was sharing the meat with you. You had to have this meal at God's house, not at your house, that is to say, at the local temple. And in a way, well, it's God who created life, and therefore God was sharing the meat with you. And that worked fine as long as there were local temples. People didn't eat meat all that often, but when they did, they could walk to the small temple in their village or in the village 2 hilltops over. Or if they lived in a larger city, they could go to the probably slightly larger temple in their local city. And that's where they would have meat. There was no such thing, in other words, as secular meat eating. All meat eating was a sacred occasion. Now, with this change in Deuteronomy that says you can't offer sacrifices anywhere other than Jerusalem, well, what do you want? What do you do if you want to have meat and you don't live in Jerusalem or near Jerusalem? Well, as we read forward here, you'll see that's the next question that Deuteronomy chapter 12 answers. I'm starting here about 5 or 6 lines down in the English. There, the book of Deuteronomy, the authors of Deuteronomy tell us, but whenever you desire, you may slaughter and eat meat in any of your settlements according to the blessing that Hashem your God has granted you. And then there's an interesting statement, the unclean and the clean alike may partake of it, as of the gazelle and the deer. What in the world does that mean? Well, a sacrificial ritual was a ritual that you could partake in only in the event that you were in a state of ritual purity. You could enter a temple and partake in a sacrificial ritual there, and therefore eat meat only when you were in a state of ritual purity. When you were not in a state of ritual purity, which is perfectly fine, it was actually normal not to be in a state of ritual purity. There's nothing bad or forbidden about being ritually impure. But when you were ritually impure, you were not allowed to go into the temple, and therefore you were not allowed to eat meat. This worked fine until there was centralization of worship in Jerusalem. And now we're being told, well, actually now there can be such a thing as secular meat eating. You don't have to be ritually pure to eat meat. You can eat meat when you're not ritually pure. Meat eating is no longer by definition a sacred occasion. Then it goes on to say, as of the gazelle and the deer. Back in Leviticus chapter 17, that's the text that's in the middle of that page of the handout, page 2 of the handout, there was a law that says that you're allowed to hunt game. Back in chapter 17, we get the law that says whenever you eat meat, it has to be a sacred occasion. You have to do it in a temple. And that raises the question of, well, what about hunting? Hunting was allowed for ancient Israelites. And if you were hunting, well, that was the one occasion that you were allowed to eat meat that was not brought to the temple. So, for example, if you hunted a deer, there were certain kosher animals that were available, like a deer or a gazelle. You were allowed to eat that out in the wild. You should pour its blood into the earth as a sort of maybe a little bit of a mini sacrificial ritual. But otherwise, yes, you could eat meat when you were hunting. What Deuteronomy chapter 12 is doing is it's alluding back to this law that's known to us from Leviticus 17. And it's saying, well, in the past, the only time that you were able to eat meat without bringing the meat to the temple was if you were out hunting, like when you were hunting deer or gazelle. Well, now all animals will be like deer or gazelle. You can have beef, you can have lamb and so forth. You can have goat meat. Even when you're at home, you don't need to take it to a temple. You'll treat them as if though they were a deer or a gazelle. So what we're seeing here between Exodus 20 and Exodus 12 is that the law has changed. There used to be a law saying that there can be many different temples in ancient Israel, and therefore that just about all meat eating, other than when you're hunting, is a sacred occasion. And then for some reasons, the authors of the book of Deuteronomy changed the law and say, no, there should only be one temple. Therefore, there can only be one altar. There's only one place where you're allowed to offer sacrifices. And that place is the temple in Jerusalem. And having made that change in the law, Deuteronomy then has to figure out how to handle certain issues. So, for example, it invents a new type of meat eating, which we could call secular meat eating and secular slaughter. You are now allowed to slaughter meat and eat it in a secular rather than a sacred manner. Some of you might know that the laws of how to slaughter animals and the laws of what makes meat kosher in the Talmud are in a tractate, a Masechet of the Talmud known as Masechet Chulin. Chulin is a Hebrew word that means that which is secular, that which is profane, that which is not sacred. And the laws that we're getting there are, how do you slaughter meat that is secular? How do you slaughter meat when you're not going to be in a temple and it's not being done in the presence of the Kohanim? Nowadays, of course, all that we've got left for meat eating is chulin, that is to say, secular meat, not meat that we bring to the temple. We're going to see that this takes that this law will have some other implications. But I just want to pause now before we go to some laws of the holidays to see if we've just got questions on what I've said so far. Essentially, what I've said so far is pretty simple. It used to be the case in biblical law that there were many temples. Then at a certain point of time, the book of Deuteronomy was written, and the opinion came to the fore that there should only be one temple. Historically, it was in fact the case that the king named Josiah in the 6th century BCE or the late 7th century BCE, actually late 7th century BCE, put this change into effect. So this Deuteronomy's idea was put into effect towards the end of the first temple period. So the point is really quite simple. The law was one way, and then the law changed to another way, which for ancient Israelites was a really, really big deal. To us, it might not seem like such a big deal because we don't have altars at all anyway. But for the ancient Israelites, this simple change was a very, very major change in the law. Wondering if there are questions just so far before we go on to the next issue, which will be the issue of laws pertaining to Passover. Julia, what's the situation so far?
We do have questions. Okay. So there was one person asked a question about Jacob building an altar in Beit El and other altars that are referenced before any of this law comes into play. Before it's given, before there's kind of a nation with a system. So the question is, what does that say? You're talking about kind of two different conceptions of meat eating. One as a mundane activity that anyone can engage in anywhere, and then another one that's about being in a relationship with God. Do we know kind of how they thought about that in the before times, as it were?
So in the before times, the norm was that no, all meat eating is a sacred act.
So when Jacob build an altar for himself, he's eating meat as a sacred act in relationship with God.
Right, because he's probably, the idea here is that if you're killing a life that God has created, you can steal that. If you were just to kill that animal and eat the meat, you're stealing something that belongs to God. And so the only way to do this is to do it as a shared meal with God. And when I say shared meal, either conceptualize that as you're sharing the meat with God. But I think at a different level, no, it's really that you understand that God is sharing the meat with you. And once you've got an altar, you're located in God's property. A temple is God's house. And so you're in God's house and God is sharing the meat with you, even though you're doing the work. The only exception to that would be if you're out hunting. And you can think of also with Jacob, actually with Isaac and Esau, that Esau goes to hunt game. That's the one exception where you're allowed to eat meat without taking it to an altar. But Jacob there is clearly engaging in a sacred act. And I think that that was the case for all meat eating until relatively late in the first temple period, when the book of Deuteronomy has already been written, and then King Josiah puts the book of Deuteronomy into effect. And at that point, we can have mundane meat eating. But yeah, back in Genesis, in all of Genesis, we're in a world where the assumption is that meat eating has to be a sacred occasion.
So the earlier law reflects how people understood eating meat up
right.
until then.
And for most of the first temple period, for most of what we think of as the heart of the biblical period, that was actually the case, that all meat eating, other than game, other than hunted meat, would take place at some sort of altar. This may have been a fairly small altar in a fairly small temple in some village, but secular meat eating that was not yet a thing. And it's interesting that when it became a thing, that there's even a technical term for it. I mean, that's the term that becomes in the Talmud chulin, or chulin. Chulin literally means profane meat, or mundane meat that is not sacred.
Right. Definitely makes one think about, how we should be thinking about meat, what we should have in mind when we consume meat today.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
It's clearly a sort of a concession. It's clearly something of a concession.
Right, yeah. Right. So I want to get to that in a second, what you just said, but before that, so a few people asked about kind of, what does this new system, the centralized system, say about access to meat by certain kind of groups? Do you have to be, a person of great means, not only to kind of have the meat, but to make this whole journey? Could women, were women allowed at the temple? Could they eat? Was this restricting meat to kind of a small elite or something like that?
So great question. So on the one hand, yeah, anyone was permitted to eat meat. And even in the older system, anybody in a state of ritual purity could eat meat. So males, females, Kohanim, non-Kohanim, everybody could eat meat. But meat eating was something that probably happened much less frequently than it does for us people in the modern world, number one. And it was special. It was sacred. It's not something that you did all the time. It's something that you would do on a holiday when you made a pilgrimage to the local temple. It might have been something that you did when you were especially thankful. You might voluntarily decide, I'd like to go to the temple because something good has happened in my life, or there's a disaster that was looming that was averted. And at that point, you might want to then have a shared festive meal with God and with other members of your family. And to do that, you and members of your family, maybe some of your neighbors, your cousins, would go to the local temple with a lamb or a goat, and you would slaughter the goat at the altar there. The priests, who are probably Levites, would know how to cut the meat up and know what parts of the meat go onto the altar. And then you and your family, you and your friends, in a state of ritual purity, would then enjoy that meat. But that's not something that happened once a week. Meat eating, especially for a larger animal like a goat or a sheep, that's something that happened much more rarely than it would for us nowadays. And a really large animal like a cow or a bull, even less frequently. Pigeons and other or doves and other birds, that might have been more common. And probably for your average peasant, which is most of the population, for your average peasant farmer, it's probably the case that when you're eating meat, it's probably a pigeon. A goat or a sheep is probably too valuable for you to slaughter it. If you're having a sheep or a goat, either this is a really special occasion, just a few times a year, or you're a person of greater means. And like a cow, al chat kama v'kama, kal v'chomer, a cow, that's something that you know, it's very, very expensive. It's not something that, it may be that's something that most people do, you know, very rarely in their lifetime.
It's helpful and it's worth bearing in mind. You know, when we read the sections of the Torah on sacrifices, they go on and on and on, and it's just, it seems, you know, it's so detailed and it almost makes it seem commonplace. And then we have references to the sacrifices. If you say the traditional liturgy, you know, on Shabbat, for example, we mentioned the sacrifices that were done on Shabbat, but it's actually, it's worth bearing in mind, like that these were special occasions, and it's sort of almost like it's worth mentioning this sacrifice or that sacrifice because it was out of the ordinary.
Exactly.
And it is a special time.
Right. Actually, on that point, it's also worth remembering that when we talk about, let's say, the Sabbath sacrifice, which we mentioned in the traditional liturgy in Musaf, and that we also read about, let's say, on all the holidays, we read the list of the animals that were sacrificed on the holidays, for the Maftir Aliyah from Numbers chapters 28 and 29. Those lists, which, you know, it's a lot of meat if you go through those lists, those were not sacrifices that regular people like you or me participated in. Those were sacrifices that were carried out by the Kohanim, probably with funding provided by the royal family, and those were done on behalf of the community. But none of that meat was eaten by people. All of that was done on the altar. That all went to God. It's not like every single family had an obligation to bring those sacrifices on the holidays. That was done for the public by the Kohanim, and your average person really had very little to do with that, other than the fact that maybe they're paying taxes or they're voluntarily making donations to a temple so that the temple has enough animals to carry out those sacrifices.
Great, thanks. Okay, so maybe we'll just do one more. Several people asked about, you know, why the change? Were there political dynamics? Was there, this is what people were doing anyway because it was practical, so the law had to change to adapt to what the people were doing? How do we understand the change?
Yeah, why the change? Why take sacrifice out of the lives of most average Israelites, which was a hugely major change. This meant the Deuteronomic revolution meant that the temple was no longer a very, very big part in the weekly life of most Israelites. It's odd. Often people think that it's the destruction of the Second Temple that really changes Judaism in the year 70 CE, 2,000 years ago, that forces the rabbis to come up with a temple-less Judaism. But actually that happened about 600 years earlier. It was the Book of Deuteronomy that removed the temple from the daily life of most Israelites and began creating a religion in which there have to be home rituals that are no longer associated with the altar. Why that change? We can only speculate, but I think that one part of the answer has to do with monotheism, that the Book of Deuteronomy felt that because there's only one God, there should only be one altar and there should only be one temple. In ancient Near Eastern religion, polytheism didn't only mean that there were lots of different gods. It also meant very frequently that there was a particular god or goddess who manifested himself or herself locally, so that there was a Baal of Hermon, but there was also a Baal of Sidon and a Baal of Tyre. There were many different Baal gods who were kind of the same god, but also they weren't the same god. Or there was an Ishtar, a goddess Ishtar of the city of Nineveh, but there was also a goddess Ishtar of the city of Arbela. And these different deities over time came to be seen as their own deities. It was probably the case, we know from certain inscriptions that have been dug up by archaeologists, that people thought that there was an Israelite god. I'm not going to pronounce the name of the Israelite god, which would be spelled in English Yahweh. I'll say Hashem instead. There was a Hashem of Zion, but there was also a Hashem of Samaria, and there was also a Hashem of the south, or a Hashem Teman. And probably some Israelites came to see these different Hashems as different gods. So if you've got local temples with local altars, then you can begin to get local Hashems, local gods, And I think that the book of Deuteronomy is worried that monotheism will begin to break down. So I think that that's a very big part of it, that at least in the eyes of the authors of Deuteronomy, multiple temples are a temptation to multiple gods. And I think there's evidence that for some Israelites, this really happened. A few centuries later, there are Israelites living in a military garrison working for the Persians in southern Egypt near Aswan. And it's clear that these Israelites were very polytheistic and they worshiped several different gods and goddesses whose names included the word Hashem. Exactly what Deuteronomy was worried about actually happened among the Israelites that we know of in Aswan in the 4th century. And probably that was happening even in earlier centuries. We just don't have the evidence for it. So I think that it has to do with monotheism. Some people would argue it has to do with money and power, that the royal family in Jerusalem, the Davidic family, wants everyone to be loyal to Jerusalem and wants this source of income always coming to Jerusalem. I think that may have played a role. I wouldn't want to overstate that, though. I think that this probably was, to a very great degree, a theological issue, because the authors of Deuteronomy, I don't think that they weren't so spectacularly loyal. Loyal is not quite the right word. They weren't so devoted to the Davidic monarchy. They don't really think very highly of kingship. For them, it's sort of just a necessary evil. So I don't think that they were just doing the bidding of a bunch of royal bureaucrats. I think that they were really thinking religiously about religious reasons why they preferred there to be one temple.
I have plenty more questions, but why don't we continue in your text because I know you have so much more to teach us.
So okay, so let's move on to the Passover laws. So this is on page 4 of the handout. You'll see that we've got at the top of page 4 a passage from the book of Exodus. And then at the bottom of page 4 and onto page 5, we've got a passage from Deuteronomy. The passage from Exodus, we modern Bible scholars believe, was very clearly written by Kohanim, by priests who were descendants of Aaron. The passage in Deuteronomy was written by Levites, and it's often the case that priests and Levites in ancient Israel competed with each other. For one thing, they competed, I think, bureaucratically and religiously as to who's going to be in charge of the temple or various temples, but they also competed religiously. They had different theologies, and therefore they had different approaches to ritual law and to law generally. So first, let's see what they say about what the priests say about the Passover ritual. So in Exodus 12, the priests tell us that back when the Israelites were just about to leave Egypt, Hashem said to Moses and to Aaron in Egypt, this month, the month that we now call the month of Nisan, this month shall be the first of your months. It shall be the first of the months of the year. Speak to all the congregation of Israel as follows. On the 10th day of this month, they, the Israelites, shall take a lamb for each family, for each household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then they and their next door neighbors will take a lamb proportionally. Each man shall contribute toward the lamb in accordance with what he eats. You shall have a lamb that is perfect, male and a year old. You can take from the sheep or the goats. You shall keep it under guard from the first day of the month until the 14th day of the month, and then all the assembly of the congregation of Israel shall slaughter it in the early evening. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts of the lintels of the house where they eat it, the houses where they eat it. They shall eat the meat that night, roasted in fire. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Don't eat it raw or boiled in water. Rather, roast it in fire, its heads, its legs, and its innards. Don't leave any of it until the morning. Burn whatever is left when the morning comes. Burn it in the fire. Okay, so here we're getting a law of what the Israelites are supposed to do the night before they leave Egypt. They're supposed to do this ritual. It's a ritual meal, and it's actually a certain kind of sacrificial meal that we know of from the book of Leviticus, in which they're sharing the meat with God. They're supposed to do this in Egypt, but later in the chapter, we're told that they should also continue doing this as a chukat olam, as a practice throughout their generations. So every year, they will commemorate this event by doing the same thing at their homes, by having this ritual meal at their homes. Now let's take a look at what the Levites say we're supposed to do for the Passover ritual in Deuteronomy chapter 16. So we're at the bottom of page 4 of the PDF. We're told there, celebrate the month of the spring and carry out the Passover sacrifice or the Passover offerings to Hashem your God. For in the month of the spring, the month that we now call Nisan, Hashem your God took you out of Egypt at night. Slaughter the Passover offerings to Hashem your God from the flock or from the herd, in the place where Hashem will choose to make his name dwell. Do not eat leaven with it. For 7 days you will eat matzot, the bread of poverty, for you left the land of Egypt in a hurry. Do this in order that you remember the day that you left the land of Egypt. Do this all the days of your life. We're then reminded, no leaven. Then in verse 5, you may not slaughter the Passover offering in any of the cities that Hashem your God gives you, but rather at the place where Hashem your God will choose to make his name dwell. You shall slaughter the Passover offering in the evening at sunset at the time when you left Egypt. You shall boil it and eat it in the place where Hashem will choose to make his name dwell. In the morning you shall turn and go back to your tents. Now, these are two passages, one by Kohanim, one by Leviim, that are basically talking about the same ritual. There's a ritual meal you're supposed to have on the night of the 14th of the month, that is the eve of the 15th of the month, the first month of the year, the month of that's in the spring, what we call the month of Nisan. You're supposed to perform this ritual in which you'll eat this meat, and it's a commemoration of leaving Egypt. You're not allowed to have any leaven with it. That's particularly emphasized. We're clearly talking, I think, about the same ritual, but there are significant differences between the way that the priests in Exodus and the Levites in Deuteronomy say to carry out this ritual. In particular, there are three differences. Number one, what animal may you use? According to the priests in Exodus, it has to be from the flock, that is either a goat or a sheep. But Deuteronomy says it can be from the flock or from the herd. That is, it can be a goat or a sheep, but it could also be a bull, a cow, an ox. So that's one difference. What kind of meat is permissible? Another difference is, where do you do this? Exodus 12 seems to be assuming you're just doing this at your own home. I think maybe they even mean you can do this at the local village altar, but you're doing this in your home village. Deuteronomy insists that you've got to do this at the place that God will choose to make God's name dwell. Hamakom asher yivchar Adonai, the place that God chooses, that is to say, the temple in Jerusalem. And notice that Deuteronomy says that repeatedly. Deuteronomy, as a later part of the Torah, is often altering earlier parts of the Torah. It's repeating the laws that we got earlier, but it's saying it's introducing some evolution, some change, some alteration into the law. And very, very often, when it introduces a new element or it changes some element, it says that several times. The authors of Deuteronomy repeat themselves 2-3 times. They'll say in the same paragraph, yeah, you heard me right. Yeah, I know you were doing this at home until now, but no, from now on, you've got to do that in the place that God will choose. And then a sentence later, and remember, you do this in the place that God would choose, as if the Deuteronomy is worried that you're going to think you heard this wrong. But no, you heard it right. Deuteronomy says it 3 times, so you make sure you know you can't do Pesach at home anymore. You've got to come to Jerusalem to do Pesach. This ritual has to be carried out in Jerusalem. And that's why it says at the very end, in the morning, you'll turn and go back to your tents. Both Deuteronomy and Exodus talk about how you've got to eat this through the nighttime and you've got to finish it before morning. Once it's light out, you've got to be done with this meal. If anything's left, you just throw it into the fire. They agree about that, but then Deuteronomy says, and then go back to your tents. In Exodus, you're not going back to your tent. You're either doing this at home or you're doing this in your local temple, which is a short walk from your home. Maybe it's on a hilltop, 2 hilltops over from your home. You're not living in tents. You're just going back home when you're done with this ritual. But for Deuteronomy, you're staying in a tent when you do this. You've left your home and you're staying in Jerusalem there are no hotels yet. So you're staying in a tent somewhere around the city of Jerusalem. In the morning, you'll leave the temple complex and you'll go back to your tent. Probably you've been up all night. You'll catch some sleep, and wake up later in the day. So that's change number 2, is that you've got to do this in Jerusalem according to Deuteronomy. That's in accordance with what we saw in Roman numeral 1, the new law of the altar, of the single altar. Also, it's interesting that Deuteronomy says that you're supposed to boil this. There's a specific way that you conduct this ritual, and it involves boiling the meat. Exodus 12 says you're supposed to roast the meat. You're supposed to roast it in fire. And then it's interesting. Exodus 12 says first you're supposed to roast it in fire. And then in verse 9 says, Exodus chapter 12, verse 9 says, don't eat it raw or boiled in water, rather roast it in fire. Well, they already told us in verse 8, you're supposed to do it roasted in fire. Why do they tell us in verse 9 that you do it, that you do it, that you're not supposed to do it raw or boiled, but roasted in fire? Why do they repeat themselves, and why do they say don't do it boiled? Because the Kohanim know what the Leviim say. Those Leviim, they say you should boil it. Don't do it that way. The right way to do it is the priestly way, the Kohen's way, which involves roasting it. You can see that the priestly practice, the Kohanim's practice in Exodus 12, they know about the Levites' practice, the way that the book of Deuteronomy is saying to do it. There's a debate going on here in ancient Israel. And there's 2 different ways to do things. And the priests are telling you, yeah, we know what the Levites say. Don't do it that way. Do it the right way. Do it the way that we say to do it, which means roasting it. I think what we're seeing here, therefore, it's not just a matter of evolution. In Roman numeral 1, we were seeing that there was one law, and at some point, it was replaced by another law. There were many temples, then there was only one temple. I think in Roman numeral 2, what we're seeing is that probably there were different practices among different groups of Israelites that were simultaneously taking place. And so we're getting a little bit of a machloket, a little bit of an argument here between 2 different groups of religious leaders about how to do this particular ritual correctly. And this is, of course, something that should sound very, very familiar to us Jews. What happens later on is that the priestly scrolls that contain the law found in Exodus and the Deuteronomic scrolls that contain the laws that are found in Deuteronomy, at some point, probably in the post-exilic period, those different scrolls are spliced together to form the Torah that we know, the 5 books of Moses that we know. And then people begin to assume, well, it's all on this one big scroll. We're supposed to observe all these laws. And then they try to figure out, well, how do we roast it and boil it at the same time? And you can see in the middle of page 5 of the handout that in the book of Chronicles, there's a description of how the Passover was observed. And they say that they boiled the Passover offering in fire in accordance with the law. Exactly what this means, I'm not even sure. And there are actually debates. There are a variety of explanations. Ibn Ezra has a particularly interesting one in the Middle Ages about how you can boil something in fire. I'm less concerned with what Chronicles intends by this than just noting that Chronicles had the same Torah more or less that we have. So they had a law that said you're supposed to boil it, and they had a law that said you're supposed to roast it. So they thought that you're somehow supposed to both roast it and boil it simultaneously. The truth is, though, I don't think that that's what either Deuteronomy or Exodus on its own intended. Especially back in Exodus, the Kohanim there say you're supposed to roast it and do not boil it. So this is not one law that's found in 2 different places, and we're supposed to sort of take elements of both. I think originally that, no, these were 2 different laws that competed with each other. And later, the book of Chronicles and later also the rabbis decide that, no, we're supposed to somehow observe both of these laws. But originally, these were not 2 different parts of the same laws. These were 2 competing versions of what we're supposed to do, on Pesach. So this is just a very, I think, to me, a very clear example of how there was machloket. There were different ways of thinking about ritual in ancient Israel. And again, this should sound familiar to us. In Judaism for the past many, many centuries, it has been the practice of Eastern European Ashkenazic Jews that after eating meat, one waits 6 hours before drinking milk or having any dairy products. One waits 6 hours. But among Sephardic Jews and also among Western Ashkenazic Jews, that is to say, among German Jews, the practice is not to wait 6 hours, but to wait 3 hours. And among Dutch Jews, the practice has been to wait 72 minutes. That is just a bit over 1 hour. There's a basic law. We all agree what the basic law is. We can't eat milk and meat together. After having meat, we have to wait some time until we're able to have a dairy product. How much time that is, there's a number of different, there are a number of different answers to that question. The same thing's going on here, I think, with the Passover laws. The basic law remains the same. The priests and the Levites actually agree on 95% of the law. On Passover, you're supposed to perform a particular sacrificial ritual, but then there are differences about how precisely one carries out that ritual. I don't want to overstate this. Let me emphasize that it's not as if though anything goes. It's not like any ritual works. No, there is a specific ritual you're supposed to perform on Passover. It's not as if though you could decide one year, you know what, this year we're going to skip the Passover ritual. Or, you know what, this year for the Passover ritual, instead of doing this thing with an animal, we're going to make up our own ritual and do something else altogether. No, there's a specific ritual and 95% of the ritual is the same. The priests and the Levites agree that one has to carry out this ritual, but some details differ. Same thing with kashrut nowadays. There are different practices as to whether one waits 6 hours, 3 hours, or 72 minutes after eating meat before one has dairy. Ashkenazim, Sephardim, Dutch Jews have a number of different rulings. In the conservative movement, we follow the Sephardic/German ruling, and we wait 3 hours. It is the case that there's several different options. They're all legitimate options, but eating meat and milk together, no, that's just not a legitimate option. Or waiting 15 minutes, that's not a legitimate option. I don't want to overstate the variety here, but within certain boundaries, there is a certain amount of variety within biblical ritual law, just as there is nowadays within rabbinic ritual law. I want to go on to take a closer look at the passage from Exodus 12, where I think we see an interesting development all by itself. But let me just pause here to see if there are questions on the difference between Exodus and Deuteronomy in regard to Passover, and on that is to say, the differences between the Kohanim and the Levi'im. Julia, what has arrived?
I was temporarily sucked into a little research thing. I turned off my camera to go get my Tanakh to clarify something that you were saying. So sorry, I was momentarily
No problem.
distracted.
You could share with us what needs clarification?
One of our participants and I were going back and forth about how the Exodus 20 law about the altar, we receive it before anything about the Mishkan is mentioned. So is it there kind of by mistake, or was there, maybe it's worth asking, was there an altar without a Mishkan, the tabernacle? And a handful of people actually did ask about, does our temples and altars sort of, do they always go together? Can you have one without the other? So
Gotcha, great.
There's the question that some other people asked as well.
So that is true. That altar law appears before the Mishkan is built and before we get even directions about the Mishkan. So let me point out actually a couple of things about that law. Actually, that whole section of law in Exodus chapters 20 through 22, the beginning of 20 through the end of 22, pretty much all of those laws are laws for once you've gotten into the land of Israel. So there's laws there about agriculture and about what you've got to do with your fields. Well, at the time that the Israelites got that law, according to the narrative in the book of Exodus, they didn't have any fields, they didn't have a country. So all of those laws, these are laws that will become relevant later on. And so it's not so unusual in that respect that we're getting a law of an altar before there necessarily was a Mishkan. I would also add though, this, as they say, I'm looking at the Torah as an anthology that's been spliced together from several originally independent sources. The law code that we're getting, or the legal passages that we're getting in Exodus 20 through 22, are not from the same original scroll or the same authors that talk about the Mishkan. The whole Mishkan thing, that all belongs to the P document, the priestly document that was written by Kohanim. The laws that we get in Exodus 20 through 22 come from what I would call the E document, the Elohist document. And the Elohist never talks about the Mishkan, never talks about this sort of portable temple. The Elohist instead talks about a smaller tent that was actually located outside the camp, not inside the camp, and it didn't serve as a temple. I actually talked about this I think in my previous Monday talk, as a matter of fact, the difference between the different tents of meeting. So in its original setting, this didn't come before the Mishkan. There was no Mishkan for the document from which this legal passage stems.
Right, so that's what I was surmising to our friend here. So I'm glad to get that confirmation. Maybe the most popular question in the last little bit was just trying to understand more about this rift or conflict or clashing views between the Levites and the priests. If you can say more about that.
Well, I think that there are consistent differences between Levites and priests as we go through the Bible. We have parts of the Bible that are written by the Kohanim, especially of the Torah that are written by the Kohanim. We Bible scholars call that the priestly document or the P document. We also have the book of Deuteronomy written by the Levites. We call this the D document. They differ on certain aspects of law, certain specifics of law. We were just looking at an example of that, but they also differ in their theology. The D theology puts a great deal of emphasis on God's transcendence. The D theology insists that God is never present in the world in any physical, literal form. The D authors are probably assuming that God is a physical being. All the biblical authors think that God has a body, but the D authors think that that body is up in heaven and never ever comes to the planet Earth. It's never part of our world. So from D's point of view, it's only a bit more of a jump to get to Maimonides' point of view, which becomes the standard view for Judaism, that God doesn't have a body at all. D doesn't actually say God doesn't have a body at all, but D says God's body never comes to the planet Earth. That is to say, as far as the world as we know it goes, God doesn't have a body. God's body is irrelevant. For D, God is really transcendent, radically unified, and in another dimension. The priests insist that God actually wants to leave heaven and come to dwell on the planet Earth. And that's the whole purpose of the Mishkan, of the temple, and of the existence of the Jewish people. The purpose of the Jewish people is to bring God into the world because God wants to actually be immanent rather than transcendent. God wants to be present in the world among God's creation. That's a gigantic difference theologically. In many respects, I think that D is the precursor to medieval and modern Jewish philosophy, whereas P is the precursor to Jewish mysticism in the medieval and modern world. To put it in Abraham Joshua Heschel's language, D is really the precursor to Rabbi Yishmael, and P is the precursor to Rabbi Akiva. So there are other theological differences, but I think that's the most core theological difference between Deuteronomy and the priestly documents. Deuteronomy, in a sense, is the path towards religious rationalism, whereas the P document is the path towards something more mystical. If I were in Christian terms, Deuteronomy is the precursor to the Protestants, and the P document is the precursor to the Catholics. There were also other differences just on a practical level between them. I think Levites and Kohanim, on a professional level, had something of they had a rivalry because the Levites had been priests at the local temples, and the book of Deuteronomy says that when the worship is all centralized in Jerusalem, the Levites from elsewhere, if they want to come to Jerusalem, they can come to Jerusalem and be full-fledged priests. But in fact, what happened was not that. In Jerusalem, in fact, the Aaronites, the descendants of Aaron, the Kohanim, they were serving as priests of the Jerusalem temple. And when Levites did arrive, they said, you can work here, but you can't work as full-fledged priests. They had a lower ranking job. They were in charge of certain areas of temple worship, but they didn't work at the altar. The most prestigious, what was thought of as the most sacred work, the work that was closest to God at the altar, the Kohanim didn't let the Leviim do that. And we can see a lot of evidence in the Bible of really professional tension as well as theological tension between Kohanim and Leviim. In a way, the Korach story is all about that tension, but that would be a whole different lecture.
Very interesting. So one more question for now, which a few people asked about, but I'm going to read the way one person phrased it. He wrote, "Do the differences between roasting and boiling reflect a philosophic / ideological machloket of disagreement, or are they simply distinct traditions without a difference?"
That's a great question. Honestly, I'm not really quite sure. I suspect that this is a distinction without any meaningful difference. You can also say, some of you might know, Ashkenazic Jews, when we put on tefillin, we wrap the tefillin like this. It's being wrapped towards us. Sephardim and also Hasidic Jews wrap tefillin, however, like that. You wind it away from you. So far as I know, and somebody out there might correct me, this is an example of a ritual distinction without a difference. There's the right way to do it, and really theologically, it doesn't really make much of a difference religiously which way you do it, just so long as you do it every day or 6 days a week. I suspect that roasting versus boiling is that kind of a thing, but I might be wrong. I'm not aware offhand, having read a certain amount of secondary literature, of anybody talking about why there would be a theological difference here. There are places where you can see a theological difference in two different halachic practices. I don't think that that's going on here. I think here this is kind of a distinction without a difference.
Great, thanks. People are making comments about their Pesach recipes, which I'm appreciating. But let's go on in the text.
Gotcha. Okay. So I want to move ahead to make a point about Exodus 12. So on the top of page 4, maybe you just glance at that. So just within the priestly passage, there's something interesting to note as well. If you look through that passage on the top of page 4, so we should be on the top of page 4 now, the passage is a little bit funny in the way that it refers to the Israelites, because as you go through it, sometimes the Israelites are described in the third person. That is, the law says they should do such and such, but at other points they're referred to in the second person. That is, the law says you should do such and such. And if we then go to the bottom of page 5 and the top of page 6, what I've done there is I've laid out the whole passage again, and the places where it says they, to talk about the Israelites, are over on the left side of the page and they're in regular font. And the places where it says you, I've indented and I've put them in italics in the English, or in it's just in a different font, happens to be Times New Roman, for the Hebrew, so that we can see that the two different types. There's one place where I'm fudging a little, and I could go into a long discussion about why I think that's necessary in that one place. But otherwise, I've just divided the passage up between the they parts and the you parts. Let me read just the they parts out loud. So this is the material that's sort of flush left in the English or flush right in the Hebrew. Hashem said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This shall mark for you the head of the months. Speak to the whole community of Israel and say that on the 10th of this month, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, let him share one with a neighbor who dwells nearby. All the assembled congregation of the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they are to eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, and they shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. What's interesting about what I just read about the parts that were, sort of flesh left in English, in other words, the third person parts of the chapter, is reading just the third person parts of the chapter. It makes sense. That text actually reads well. You get a basic law about how to celebrate Passover by reading just those words, those sentences. Now let's take a look at the you parts of the chapter, the parts that are in italics and indented in the English, or just in that kind of like older style font and indented in the Hebrew. I'm going to read all of those out loud now. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you, in proportion to the number of persons. You shall contribute for the lamb according to what each household will eat. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a yearling male. You may take it from the sheep or the goats. You shall keep watch over it until the 14th day of the month. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in any way with water, but roasted, head, legs, and entrails over the fire. You shall not leave any of it over until the morning. If any of it is left until morning, you shall burn it. This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering to Hashem. Okay, reading just that section, the second person sections, if you just read that by itself, it doesn't make sense. It's not an independent document of its own. This is not a law that once existed by itself. So for example, the words, it shall be the first of the months of the year for you. Well, what's it? Or in the Hebrew, who? What's the who? We've got a pronoun there that is referring back to something that appears in the non-italics part of the chapter, the part that's flush left in the English. We've got something that's referring back to a previous phrase. Similarly, the language in proportion to the number of the persons, that's just a sentence fragment. On its own, it doesn't really make sense. And the rest of that passage, it doesn't make sense by itself. It makes sense as a continuation of the material that's flush left in the English, the material that's not in italics. My point here is that when you separate the chapter into its 2 components, one of those components reads well by itself. The other component only reads well if you've also read the first component. What's going on here? I think what's going on here is that the third person parts, the parts that are not in italics, that's the original text. That's what the original priests, that's what Kohanim originally wrote as their law of the Passover. What's going on in the italicized sections? What we're getting there, you might think for yourself, if you had to give a name to this, if you had to give a noun to describe what's happening in the italicized parts of the chapter, I think you might come up with, it's a supplement, or it's an explication, or it's a commentary. This is in fact a commentary. And those of you who are familiar with Midrash or with medieval Jewish biblical exegesis, you know that how traditional Jewish interpretation works is you quote a little bit of a verse, and then there's a comment after it. And then you quote a little bit of the verse, and then you've got the rabbi's comments after it. What we're getting here is, in a sense, early commentary, the earliest or one of the earliest rabbinic commentaries. The stuff that's in the second person, the stuff that's in italics, that was added by later priests. This is added on by the children or great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren of the priests who wrote the original version. In other words, I'm suggesting, there's no archaeological proof of this, no one's ever found this, but I'm suggesting that the material that I've put there in regular font once existed on some scrap of parchment or of leather, once existed on its own small scroll. And then a few generations later, grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the Kohanim who had written that original scroll were copying that scroll onto a new scroll, and they wanted to make some things clearer. So for example, what does it mean in Hebrew to say that this is the Rosh Chodesh, literally the head of the months? Well, they just make clear, well, that means it's the first of the months. When you're counting the months, this is the one that counts as number one. Or what does it mean in verse 4 to say, if a lamb, down there in verse 4, what does it mean to say, if the household is too small for a lamb, he should share a lamb with a neighbor who dwells nearby? Well, okay, that's simple. If your family and their family is just too small for each family to have its own lamb, you'll go in together. But what if my family has 4 people and their family has 8? Do I have to pitch in the same amount? And then that question is answered. No, do it in proportion to the number of persons. In other words, if your family has 4 members and their family has 8 members, they should be paying twice as much for the lamb as you're paying. And then we also get some other information. In verse 8, it says you're supposed to roast it over the fire, but the priests who are now copying over this older priestly text, they know, you know what, those Levites down the road, they're not roasting it in fire, they're doing it boiling. So let me emphasize that. So verse 9 repeats what we got in verse 8 kind of more insistently, just to make sure it's roasted. It's not boiled. I said roasted. I said not boiled. And then it gives some more detail about how exactly you're supposed to do this. It's actually interesting that verse 9, I think, specifically disagrees with Deuteronomy, but then verse 10 specifically agrees with Deuteronomy. In other words, there's this older text. Now the priests who are copying over and making a new version of the older text, they want to remind you, okay, don't do it the Deuteronomist way. That is, don't boil it. You got to roast it. But the Deuteronomists are right about the whole don't let it go over until the morning thing. So they want to say, it's not that the Deuteronomists get everything wrong. We do agree with them about how it's all got to be done before the sun rises. What we're getting here is really a text and commentary. So as we've gone through Roman numeral 1 and then Roman numeral 2, what we've seen is sort of 3 different examples of change in biblical law having to do with ritual. Number 1 was simply an example of there was one law and now the law has been modified so that instead of there being many temples, now there's only one temple. At the beginning of Roman numeral 2, by comparing Deuteronomy and Exodus, we saw that there were sometimes just machloket. There was disagreement about how correctly to do something, and those 2 different ways of doing them probably coexisted, just as nowadays there are Jews who are very careful about being shomer mitzvot, who wait 6 hours, and there are Jews who are careful about being shomer mitzvot, who wait only 3 hours. And now at the end of Roman numeral 2, in this last example at the bottom of page 5 and the top of page 6, we're seeing that there was also just explanation. It's not that the later priests, in italics, were disagreeing with their predecessors, the earlier priests whose material was not in italics. It's just that they're explaining it more clearly. They want to make sure that people understand exactly how to do this. They're answering some questions about where the text the older text might not have been clear. So 3 different phenomena that we associate with ritual law in rabbinic Judaism, with ritual law nowadays in Judaism. We're seeing these same 3 phenomena within the Torah itself. That is, the law changes deliberately. Number 1, there are some practices regarding which there are simply differences and both ways of doing something coexisted. Number 2, and number 3, as legal texts were studied and copied and made into new copies, there was supplementation and explanation. There was commentary. All of these features that we probably associate with rabbinic Judaism, and in some ways maybe even especially with modern liberal Judaism in terms of changing of law, all of those phenomena are already happening within the Bible itself. And that's the main point that I want to make here, that some of us might think that changing Jewish ritual law is something that began in the 1960s, like it all had to do with Woodstock or something. First Woodstock happened, and then within a few years, women were getting aliyot, and a few years later, we're ordaining women as rabbis. No, this kind of ritual, this kind of evolution, this deliberate development of Jewish law in accordance with certain values, this was happening already in ritual law in the biblical period itself. And we can see traces of these processes and of these phenomena in the text of the 5 books of Moses, in the text of the Torah itself, when we take a careful, close look at those biblical texts. And I've said this many times before. I'll say it again today and probably again in the future, some subsequent Monday. I think a lot of what we might think of as modern Judaism has roots that go much, much, much deeper into ancient forms of Judaism and even into the biblical period, even into the Torah itself. And that's something very important for us to realize about our own modern forms of religious Judaism, that they're not just modern, they are in fact, in the processes that they encourage, quite traditional and even biblical. Tov, I'll go as far as that, and I'd like to see some last questions in the time that we've got left.
There was a question that came in that is slightly not directly related to what you were saying, but I think the best question for right now. So I know that you didn't prepare to talk about this, but I'm confident that you can anyway, which is it's well timed that you were talking about all this temple ritual with Tisha B'Av coming later this week, where we're marking the destruction of the temple, and the person was asking specifically about, we recall the destruction of the temple as a massive national tragedy that remains a tragedy, and we sort of look towards a third temple, although that, of course, varies depending on whose liturgy you're using. But even just in the very morning of it, as a calamity that's sort of not just in the past, but something still present. Kind of on the theme of change, right? Our relationship to sacrifice has changed radically between the period that you're sharing these texts from and now. So I don't know, kind of in light of those changes, I guess the question is, how do you think about Tisha B'Av and maybe sort of how we think about these sacrifices today as something to mourn, not mourn?
Yeah, great question. So change happens for a number of reasons. The ones that we're looking at today, these are changes that happened internally within biblical religion and voluntarily, but change also happens, you might say, externally and involuntarily. The end of sacrifice in Jewish religious practice was not a choice that the Jewish people made. It was a choice that was imposed on us by a foreign invader. It is often the case, by the way, rather frustratingly, that you hear sometimes people talk about how the rabbis got rid of sacrifice. And whenever I hear people talking about how, like, the rabbis have created a new form of Judaism and the rabbis got rid of sacrifice, I ask myself, like, when did we give Vespasian and Titus smicha? The rabbis never got rid of sacrifice. It was 2.5 Roman legions who got rid of sacrifice. And then the rabbis, having been given lemons by the Romans, they were forced to make lemonade. And in rabbinic Judaism, in the Mishnah, in the Talmuds, they come up with forms of religious expression that don't require sacrifice. But that wasn't a choice that the rabbis made. The rabbis regard that event as a terrible tragedy, and the rabbis require us several times a day to pray for the reversal of that event. So on the one hand, the end of sacrifice, that it was a tragedy from a traditional Jewish point of view. It was something that was imposed upon us from without. But on the other hand, in light of what we saw in Roman numeral 1 today, in light of the law from Deuteronomy chapter 12, I think it does turn out to be the case that the end of sacrifice in the year 70 CE, when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, or even in the year 586 BCE, when the Babylonians destroyed the First Temple, it was probably less of a gigantic, shattering calamity for your average Jew or your average Israelite than we sometimes tend to think. Because in terms of the day-to-day or even week-to-week or month-to-month life of an ancient Jew, it wasn't the Romans who took the temple out of your life, out of your religious life on a daily, weekly, even monthly basis. It was actually the book of Deuteronomy who had done that much earlier. Once the book of Deuteronomy says you're not allowed to have temples in your local villages. You're not allowed to have temples in your local cities. Basically, the temple no longer played a very big role in the day-to-day, week-to-week, even month-to-month life of most Israelites, except for the Israelites who lived in the city of Jerusalem or right nearby the city of Jerusalem. And so I think that what we attribute to the rabbis already is happening in the Bible itself. That is to say, a lot of modern scholarship emphasizes that the rabbis created a new religion that depended on home rituals and depended on prayer and depended on study now that the temple is no longer available. But all of those things are happening already in the biblical period, long, long before the Romans, long before the rabbis. The book of Deuteronomy itself already says that there have to be certain home rituals rather than temple rituals, that there have to be little sacred reminders in the home, since you no longer have access to a sacred place at a temple. So for example, when Deuteronomy says every Israelite household has to have some words of Torah written on the doorposts of the house, that is in the Shema prayer, what we now think of as the mitzvah of mezuzah. When Deuteronomy is saying every single household has to have a few words of the Torah incised into the doorpost, it's saying every household has to have its own little sort of sacred space. It's not sacred in the same way or to the same extent as the temple, but the temple is far away. So you have to have this little locus of the sacred at home. And the temple and the book of Deuteronomy says every single Israelite has to murmur some words of the Torah every single evening, every single morning. What we know now as the mitzvah of Shema, saying the Shema morning and evening. That means that every individual Israelite is bringing the sacred into his or her daily existence twice a day, even though they no longer have access to the temple. So the rabbinic revolution, at one level, it's important to realize the rabbinic revolution of creating this home-based, synagogue-based, study-based, text-based religion, it wasn't something that the rabbis chose. It was forced on the rabbis by the Romans. But on the other hand, it's also important to realize that, well, actually, it wasn't just the Romans who took the temple out of daily religious life. And it's not just the rabbis who responded to it. The book of Deuteronomy decided to take the temple out of most people's religious life. And the book of Deuteronomy came up with text-based and sort of study-based practices that make the religion something more of a home religion and something more of an individual religion. So I think as we're going into Tisha B'Av and mourning the destruction of the temple, that is still worth doing because it was something that was imposed upon us from outside. And furthermore, because it was the beginning of a process that led to 2,000 years, not only of exile, but of exile and oppression and persecution. But I think it is also legitimate to realize that, like, the lemonade that the rabbis made out of that tragic event followed a recipe that the book of Deuteronomy had written long before those tragic events. And therefore, the lemonade isn't just something that should be, mourned. Like the fact that we've got to drink this, it actually tastes pretty good. And after 2,000 years of it, I don't think that it's so surprising or radical to say, yeah, looking forward, maybe who knows what's going to actually happen at the Eschaton, at the time of the coming of the Messiah. But who knows? Maybe there will be a temple, but there won't be animal sacrifices in it. Maybe, there'll just be a temple that involves a whole lot more lemonade. So that was a quick answer to a deeper question, but I hope that made some sense.
It did, and it's perfectly timed since we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much for teaching us today and for this, just a really cool zooming into a very close reading of biblical text in a way that that shows us, as you just said in response to the last question, that the kind of the malleability of tradition in a way that it needs to be in order for humans to live it, is something that really goes way back to the beginning. So thank you for teaching us today. I want to thank once again Yale Aswell for your very generous sponsorship, and I want to invite everyone to come back next week. Until the substitution today, we were shifting into the modern part of this series, so we'll be going back to that next week. JTS fellow and alum Dr. Michal Rauscher will be teaching us on evolving Jewish attitudes towards abortion. An important topic, very needless to say, and I hope that you'll join us. It should be a really interesting and valuable session. And in the meantime, I hope it's a meaningful Tisha B'Av for all those who are observing, and enhanced by the insights that Professor Sommer to share with us. Thanks so much again.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Som Kal.